Afternoon. This is going to be a short video that it's only about 20 minutes long. So it's David Ray Griffin being interviewed by Bob McKeown of the show The Fifth Estate, which aired on November 27, 2009 on the Canadian Broadcasting Company. Of course, the events of September 11, 2001 are discussed. And let's see what David Ray Griffin has to say. And what I'll do is I'm going to actually stop at certain points of the video and we'll discuss and see what happens there.
This current life of yours is so far, it seems to me, from that of the usual process theologian. Was it a gradual process? Was it an epiphany? How did it happen?
When 9/11 happened, I accepted the view that this was blowback for U.S. foreign policy. I saw my book didn't even have a chapter on U.S. foreign policy. It was a theme in each chapter, but I didn't deal with it explicitly. So I started writing a book on U.S. Imperialism.
Also, there's a link between religion and the truth movement, because with religion, the spiritual aspects of religion are taken on faith and not on evidence. With September 11th, certain people in the truth movement have taken things on faith rather than evidence.
Well, I learned a lot of things that I hadn't known before, and particularly how we had engineered pretexts for wars in the past. Everybody knows about the Gulf of Tonkin event, that was fabricated, but we did that to start the Spanish-American War, Mexican War. We're on the property now that we stole from Mexico because of that. So I learned that. But it was a year after 9/11, a colleague, theological colleague from another country, said he thought 9/11 was an inside job. And I thought, well, you know, that's interesting, and I know we've done things, but I don't think the Bush administration, even the Bush administration, would have done such a thing. But show me the evidence. And he sent some websites. I looked at them, and I didn't find it convincing. It wasn't till March of 2003, about the time we were going into Iraq, that I was exposed to another website which had part of the 9/11 timeline on it that Paul Thompson had put out. And there I saw there were literally hundreds of stories that had been in the mainstream press that contradicted some aspect of the official story. So that's how I got started.
John Farmer, in his book, makes the statement that, is a quote, virtually everything in the official story as told to the public, the U.S. Congress, and the 9/11 Commission by the government and the military was totally and inexplicably untrue. Do you believe that's an accurate statement?
I believe almost everything in the 9/11 Commission report, of which John Farmer was one of the authors, is false. Yes.
Well, and here's the problem, is that I'm not saying he didn't read the report. I'm pretty sure that he did. But what he doesn't realize is that most of the information relating to 9/11 is missing from the report. So the story is pretty much disingenuous, right? Certain parts of the report are true, like the planes were hijacked. But because that represents the official story, that has to be opposed at all costs, even if the opposing scenario or theory is outright irrational, if it's absolutely defying a rationale, as long as it's against the official narrative of hijackers, phone calls, hijacked planes, hijacked crash sites at the Pentagon, World Trade Center, Shanksville, all that represents the official story. And it's been beaten into the truth movement for 20 years by people like David Ray Griffin.
I have a little essay in which I call it the 9/11 Commission Report, a 571-page lie. Now, John Farmer and I would disagree on which parts are the the lies and which parts are not. For example, he believes that the military lied to the commission about when they became aware of the planes being hijacked or being in trouble. And the 9/11 commission, see, the early story was they were notified by the FAA, but just not quite in time to get there on time. So they raced to get there, but they couldn't quite make it, either to the World Trade Center or to the Pentagon. But then the 9/11 Truth Movement showed actually there was plenty of time, given the way these interceptions work and the distances and the speed of these planes. They could have made it, and absolutely to the Pentagon, where they had 20 minutes.
Right here with the Pentagon, they could have, but not with the World Trade Center. Okay, now here's the thing. NORAD actually testified at the 9/11 Commission. You had retired Lieutenant Generals Rick Scott, who gave a timeline, but the timeline was completely false. Even Thomas Keane and Richard Benvenisti, they all noticed that the timeline was not matching up to the FAA timeline. And so during the report and through media interviews, that they even lambasted Ralph Eberhart and Larry Arnold for giving a false timeline, and Rick Scott for giving a false timeline, which you can view on my 9/11 Commission playlist, actually. But at the time, when the commission heard these people and they're given a timeline, afterwards, when they wrote the report, basically said, hey, these guys weren't very truthful regarding the timeline, and they wanted an updated timeline, and they never got it.
And so lo and behold, suddenly we get this new story. The 9/11 Commission tells us that that wasn't true. They weren't notified until after the planes had already crashed, and that they had colluded with the FAA. They had protected the FAA. Well, that's just, this would mean that they were willing to make it look like they had been incompetent or had been involved in a stand down in order to protect the FAA's reputation. Nobody believes that's true. So I've dealt with this at great length in my books, most recently in The New Pearl Harbor Revisited. So it's much too complex to deal with here, but the story John Farmer is telling is based on the idea that these military people lied by saying they had been notified by the planes in advance.
The first thing that seems counterintuitive about that morning is air defense. One would presume that the skies between Washington and New York would simply be the best defended anywhere. Yet that wasn't the case on that morning. How out of the ordinary was what happened that day?
Oh, it's just so out of the ordinary that it's completely implausible. Now, you might say the first flight, maybe people were kind of asleep, not really paying attention. That's not very plausible either when you learn about the FAA and you find out how rigorous their procedures are. But let's say, for sake of argument, maybe they goofed up on the first one. The second one, after one World Trade Center building's already been hit, they're not going to be paying attention to flight.
Okay, here's what Griffin really doesn't understand. This is an unprecedented event in history, multiple hijackings. And we've never seen anything like this before. Now, what made this really complex for the FAA was that they basically were trying to contact these planes, but because there was no contact with 175, they did with the Flight 11, where Mohammed Atta basically broadcasted, we have some planes where the FAA, and you could hear this on the air traffic control at Boston Center, at New York Center as well, where they're like, the air traffic controllers are basically trying to ascertain what's going on with the first plane. And while that was happening, the second plane's being hijacked, 175, as 11 is crashing into the North Tower. Now they're trying to contact 175, but there's no contact. So they don't know what's happening on that plane. And by the time they found out that 11 had crashed into North Tower, the FAA basically now reporting back to their superiors, and their superiors basically are telling air traffic control not to spread word to anybody else about what's going on. Now, I don't know why they said this. Who knows why they were doing this? Was it not to cause panic? I don't know. I couldn't tell you a definitive answer. But something happened here. There's a disconnect. So Boston Center actually tried to get in contact with NEADS, Northeast Air Defense System. So while this is going on, we need you guys to scramble some jets up there. Now, that's fine. But what could they possibly do? They have to get authority to have weapons on the plane. Then they have to get authority for a shoot down order, which didn't come until 10:30 a.m. Bush is supposed to give the shoot down authority. The Secretary of Defense is second in command when it comes to military chain of command. Vice President is not, but that's another argument.
175. And then after 2 World Trade Center buildings are hit, and everybody knows that the Pentagon was always known as ground zero, that if terrorists were going to attack, that would be the place they would want to attack.
Right.
If they hated America, hated American foreign policy. And the idea that a plane could turn around in the Midwest and lumber back to Washington and 20 minutes later attack the Pentagon, which is surely the most well-protected building in the world.
The most well-protected building in the world? I know casinos in Las Vegas that are much more protected than the Pentagon, actually. In fact, there's more cameras on a casino on Las Vegas Boulevard than any building in the world. So Griffin, you would be wrong there. But I agree with you that when the towers were hit, the Pentagon had to be on high alert. And by the way, there were people who were raising the bar at the Pentagon. In fact, there was one official who told an NBC reporter what was happening in New York, saying, hey, we might be hit next too. Now, of course, if you bothered to read the intelligence cables regarding, which are public, some are anyway, regarding the summer of 2001, where the Pentagon was actually a target for a operation by Al-Qaeda. Now that goes back to the mid-90s. Bajinka plot, for example. So it's not like that this was information that was kept hidden. It was well known that the Pentagon was actually targeted. In fact, in October of 2000, the Pentagon emergency team ran an operation called MASCAL, M-A-S-C-A-L, where they are preparing for a plane to crash into the Pentagon.
Is completely implausible. The details of that, again, are so complex. I've dealt with them in great detail in my book. But yes, that's one of many, many, many dimensions of the story that are beyond belief. We can't as strongly prove that's false as clearly as we can prove the stories about the World Trade Center collapses are false. There we've got rigorous scientific information. But the evidence is very, very, very strong that the story they're telling, they've told 3 versions of the story now, and that all 3 versions are false.
Let's talk about towers 1 and 2. What is the most compelling evidence you see there that all is not as the official story would have us believe?
With the Twin Towers?
Yes.
Well, it's so much. The most obvious would be the fact that these two buildings, which were steel-framed high-rise buildings, and when we're talking about steel-framed, the point is that there were 287 steel columns that went from the sub-basements through the roof. And in the lower floors, these were absolutely massive. They taper off, of course, as you go to the top. The ones in the, I'm talking here about the core columns. There were 47 core columns and then 240 columns around the outside. For the building to come down as they did, straight down, all 287 steel columns had to fail simultaneously. Think about that. And the theory is that it was fire that caused the steel columns to weaken, and that's what brought the building down. Well,
Trusses were to weaken, and that led to the evidently natural collapse. That's what NIST is proposing.
first of all, steel frame high-rise buildings have never come down.
Well, that's not true. Now, I have made a list of steel frame buildings that have collapsed, including the General Motors plant in Livonia in 1953, McCormick Place in Chicago in 1967, Kmart Fire in Falls Township, Pennsylvania in June of 1982, the Sandoz Storage Facility in Basel, Switzerland in 1986, Sight and Sounds Theater in Strasbourg, Pennsylvania in 1997. And of course, after 2001, you had the Madrid Windsor Hotel, the Mumbai High North Platform in 2005, Dogwood Elementary School in Reston, Virginia in 2006, and of course, the Plasco Steel 17-story high-rise in Tehran, Iran in 2017. So, you have those issues to deal with, right? Now, there hasn't been a true high-rise building because there's no buildings that high that have caused, World Trade Center was 110 stories tall. When was the last time a building was hit by a plane as well? On top of the fire that happened. So yeah, this argument that steel frame buildings don't collapse is demonstrably false.
Because of fire. Secondly,
but the argument that you've heard over and over is that two buildings like that have never been hit by jetliners going 600 miles an hour either.
oh sure, but also it's amply documented that these buildings were built, these were very tall buildings. They knew they might get hit by planes, so they did the calculations, took the biggest plane of the time, the 707, and let's say this would hit the building. The determination was you would have fires, you would have some loss of life, the buildings would stand.
Wrong. That's disingenuous. Yes, the test was done for a 707. Yes, they were testing to see if a plane would cause mass fires. No, what Ray Griffin isn't telling you is that the 707 itself was low on fuel and lost in a fog. And that's what hit the World Trade Center. That was the test they were running. That's coming from Les Jameson, I think is his name. I forgot, one of the architects that was running that drill. Now, what's the difference? Well, a 757-222 bus series is much bigger than a 707. These planes were fully loaded with 11,900 gallons, which is 78,000 pounds of fuel approximately. That's the difference.
It would be a relatively minor incident. So they were ready for that. Furthermore, the buildings were standing for, in one case.
Also, not to say that there could have been improvised devices somewhere in the building that to guarantee that the towers collapsed. Were they located up high, low, or in the basements? According to some people that were in the basement levels of the World Trade Center, they heard additional explosions. What did that come from?
10 minutes, in another case about not quite an hour, and they were perfectly still. So whatever the planes had done, the impact of the planes had done, that was long gone. You had fires in the building, and you had here and there fires, not clear through the building, and they were actually starting to burn out by the time. They were not massive, these were not towering.
As if Griffin was there. According to the phone calls made within the towers, the fires were raging, actually, especially in the upper floors, not at the impact hole, but the fires rose up because what was burning? Office furnishings, paper. All this continued to rage. I mean, you don't even need to listen to Griffin here. You could just look at the multiple videos that are on. I have a number of NIST videos uploaded on my playlist where you can see a raging inferno, actually. That's why you see the smoke billowing out of the World Trade Center, thick, black, acrid smoke. That's what the people in the towers described it as. The heat was so enormous that you could see people just leaning out their windows. What was that from there, Griffin?
Infernos for very long. And so let's say that you could imagine that for some reason the fire was causing the steel to weaken. Well, it would have started gradually to, the steel would have started to sag. You look at the videos, you don't have sagging. You have absolutely still buildings, which all of a sudden just start coming down.
Well, first of all, you don't know what was going on inside the building, right? You weren't inside the building to notice whether the floors were sagging underneath you or on top of you. There's a good video. It's Dean Riviere video. I think he shot it from like a hotel or an adjacent building, which shows the inward lean of the South Tower. You could see it lean. It's a great video. I have it uploaded on my playlist in the NIST videos. Go watch that. It's remarkable. I think it's the best clear video, one of them anyway.
In the case of the South Tower, you do have that section above the point of impact, which moves forward.
Yes.
Which starts to disintegrate and then goes straight.
Yeah, I'm talking about after the initial explosions. Now, that's another thing. Both buildings explode at the top. And
what's funny is a demolition expert, the 9/11 Truth Movement usually raises, is Danny Jowenko, the late Danny Jowenko. I think he died in 2011. Basically, he was looking at videos of World Trade Center 1 and 2 and basically said these are not demolition buildings. He thinks 7 may have been, but he definitively says that demolitions start at the bottom, not at the top. And he basically, this is omitted by certain truth people, 9/11 truthers, who don't show that part, right?
And how do you see that? How do you evaluate that?
Well, this is more evidence that the explosives were placed because, for many reasons, but the most dramatic is that you had steel columns and sometimes sections of steel columns, 3 or 4 columns, still held together, being blown out horizontally 500 to 600 feet and sometimes plastered on neighboring buildings. So we've got videos. You can see this. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. Well, I wonder. Let's see. 110-story building where it's collapsing and debris is shooting outward. What is that from? Is it from the collapse of building or explosions? I'm not a physics expert. I don't claim to be. And I can give you an opinion, but it's not based on any experience whatsoever. So why is David Ray Griffin being asked to give his opinion, which is based on what? He's an engineer. He's a demolition expert. He's a theologian. Why don't you ask a demolition expert? You know, architects and engineers, I think, has one. Tom Sullivan, I think his name is. Gives some validity.
The theory is that the only
But you got to be honest, right? If you're basically looking at 9/11, already saying that it's an inside job, well, then you're not doing your due diligence, right? Of being honest. You can't take a position. You got to investigate, look at the evidence, and then make a determination. That's called the scientific method. But that's not what David Ray Griffin does here. That's not what other people in the truth movement, like Christopher Bolin or Jason Burmis, or these others do. They already went in saying, 9/11 is an inside job. So they're only going to look at stuff that agrees with that worldview. And that's disingenuous at best.
These sources of energy were the impacts of the airplanes, that's long gone, the fires, and gravity. Gravity pulls things straight down. What's the source of energy to blow sections of steel weighing many, many, many thousands of pounds out 500 to 600 feet horizontally? So that's what, with the towers, you have that. And then you've got a very strange thing with the South Tower, that top section starts to fall off sideways. And by the law of the conservation of energy and momentum and various physical laws, it should have kept going. Suddenly, it freezes in place, it explodes, and just goes straight down. So that's...
You know, if you want to look at like scientific studies like David Chandler and Wayne Costi, they do enormous work in this direction. So, I mean, I would listen to them before I'd listen to Griffin, actually, about what happened at the World Trade Center.
That's impossible in itself, according to the official theory. But then, once that occurs, then the whole...
Then you got an opposing view, right? Then you got people like Mick West, who basically isn't an engineer, but claims that the World Trade Centers were not under any controlled demolition. And he's a debunker. So he does his own studies about what happened at World Trade Center. But here's the thing, would you rather listen to David Chandler or Mick West, who has the more reputable background? And you're gonna say, well, David Chandler's a crackpot, right? Well, David Chandler actually employed the scientific method when it came to the Pentagon, and he was vilified for it by fringe conspiracy theorists. And this brings up a conundrum for debunkers, right? Is he so right at the Pentagon? How can he be so right at the Pentagon, yet so wrong at the World Trade Center? Could he be? Sure. Is he? I don't know. I can't tell you. I'm not qualified to speak on that. I would rather have, say, for example, a high-rise engineer or a demolition expert that is not affiliated with the truth movement debate somebody like a David Chandler and Wayne Costi, and they're up for a debate. I've spoken with them. I've interviewed them. They're welcome to it.
Building comes down, and at virtually free fall acceleration, which means that the lower floors, with all of their steel and concrete, and remember, there are no fires down there. The fires are up there, and you've got these enormous steel columns, and the top part of the building comes right through the lower part of the building as if it weren't there. None of that concrete or steel seems to offer any resistance whatsoever. Virtually,
You know, I really wish I knew more about the subject of like the World Trade Centers 1, 2, and 7. And because I'm so like lacking when it comes to mathematics and physics, I'd rather just talk about what I know and what I think I know anyway regarding geopolitics of 9/11, as minuscule as my knowledge is. But I would rather have people like I said, Chandler and Costi or Tony Zambotti talk about those issues. They're much more qualified. They have a background that goes back, you know, well over 25 years. I think Chandler's been a professor at the University of Colorado, you know, for 20 something years, maybe in 30. Um, he's a, you know, has a degree in electrical engineering. Yeah, you know, but like I said, you have to look at the issue honestly with an investigative eye, not coming into saying already that 9/11 is an inside job, because you're only going to try and prove that your initial response to 9/11 is true. And if you've been told that the official narrative is false for 20 years, basically you're going to create scenarios, even irrational ones, that contradict the official narrative.
no resistance, or you wouldn't have it coming down at virtually the acceleration of free fall.
Now, if you talk to architects and engineers who believe the official story, they say that you've got these floors that are an acre in size, virtually, and that all of that air being expelled as the top floor reaches the next floor expels the steel and all that dust and everything else out the side with the forces that you see. How do you respond to that?
Do you know anybody who would go on the public record making such a ridiculous comment, put their name to it? I've not seen anybody. I can believe they're going to tell you that in private. I don't know of any professional engineer who's not a government employee or who's not working for a company who depends on government contracts who would say such a thing.
We talked.
And I make that point, by the way, because I don't know, in my new book, Upton Sinclair makes this famous statement that it's very difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. So I know there are many architects and engineers who will tell you they believe the official story because their salaries depend on it.
Well, okay, so you're telling me that in 2009 there weren't retired architects and engineers that would defend the official story, right? It's now 2022. Like I said, I would love to see that debate. It's never happened before.
For many years, we were arguing, and Key Dudney led the way here, that these cell phone calls from the plane simply were not possible. There were about 15 calls from the 4 planes total that were said to be cell phone calls.
That's wrong. Okay, so you had on 11 you had 1. On 175 you had 1. On 77 you had 1. And on 93 you had Tom Burnett, C.C. Lyles, and Ed Felt, 3. Okay, the rest were seatback phones. Nothing on those cell phone calls, by the way, illuminated anything that would be against the narrative. Nothing was really contradictory, I guess. Nothing illuminating in regards to those phone calls. Now, on the seatback phones, yes. Now, there was one phone call which basically went against the script, right? And that's Renee May on Flight 77, where she says that the plane was hijacked by 6 men. Well, if that phone call is faked, as Ray Griffin suggests, why didn't it say 5? Okay. As for Tom Burnett says basically they had knives on the plane and one of them had a gun. Well, that would be against the narrative of just box cutters on these planes. This is where I take issue with Griffin, is that because there are some phone calls, especially for Flight 93, where they illuminate illuminate certain anomalies regarding what happened on that plane. There were 6 phone calls. For example, there were 6 phone calls on Flight 93, 4 by civilians, 2 by flight attendants. And all 6 of these phone calls basically said that there were only 3 hijackers. Now, according to the FBI's Pent Bomb report and to the 9/11 Commission, there were 4. Ziad Jarrah, the pilot, Saeed Al-Ghamdi, Ahmed Al-Haznawi, and Ahmed Al-Nami. Those are the muscle hijackers. 3 of those phone calls basically said that the individuals they saw were dark-skinned males with red bandanas. Have you Googled what Ziad Jarrah looks like? He looks very white, not dark-skinned at all. So that's just for Flight 93. But Ray Griffin is willing to throw these away because to him, cell phone calls can't work. And there's other things that he's basically going to say, which are outright false. So if you don't look into, if you're going to say that the phone calls are fake, that the planes aren't hijacked, there is no investigation, right? Because all the intelligence agencies that were running pre-operations on these Al-Qaeda operatives inside the United States, in Germany, in Malaysia, even in the many years in the early 90s, when they were running signals intelligence on monitoring the cell phone calls of Osama bin Laden and an Al-Qaeda communications hub in Yemen. 6 years, they were running these operations separately. Because bin Laden had his phone from 92 to 98, and the Al-Qaeda communications hub in Yemen was from 1996 to 2001. What do you think they were talking about in those calls, right? Also, what about the human intelligence? CIA, DIA. How about foreign intelligence? Israeli Mossad, using art student ring, moving companies, Saudis out west, giving money and lodging to certain hijackers. All of this doesn't exist. All the metadata, all the human intelligence that goes back to the early 90s, all of this doesn't exist if there are no hijackers. Because what operations?
And many of the calls that were most important for getting the story in the public mind about these hijackers on the planes were said to be cell phone calls. And 3 or 4 of the calls were said to be from Tom Burnett on Flight 93, who called his wife Dina Burnett 3 or 4 times and told her what was going on the plane. And she knew he was calling on her cell phone because she looked on the caller ID, and there's Tom's cell phone number. So there was no doubt about it. Other people just said, they were calling me on a cell phone. Yeah. But
presuming it might have been.
Yeah, so maybe they missed. But with Dina, how could she couldn't have made a mistake. So this was a big problem. So in 2004, the FBI changed its story just before it turned in its report to the 9/11 Commission and said, actually, there weren't any high altitude. That was Key Dudney's point. Cell phone calls might be possible from an airliner, but only from a very low altitude.
This is not true, by the way. So when it comes to Ed Feld, and we have FBI memorandum for the records. This is predating the 9/11 Commission report. This is coming from the FBI Pent Bomb report, which he doesn't even bring up. Now, the FBI explicit, this is coming from the FBI memorandum for the record. Well, like I said, this is a 2002 interview with Dina Burnett, where the FBI explicitly said that Tom Burnett may have made additional cell phone calls to his wife. They are therefore not denying that Dina Burnett could have seen his caller ID. Contradictions, however, still exist, and that Dina Burnett seemed to be clear that the first call was made by cell phone. For instance, while the phone records used in the Moussaoui trial point to it being the last. But again, that's assuming she received only 4 phone calls. And the FBI interview showed Burnett herself wasn't sure about that. She wasn't sure that the first call was a cell phone call. But isn't it almost impossible to make cell phone calls from an altitude? Well, no. I mean, the so-called evidence for this involves testing phones while flying over an urban area where cell phone base stations ranges are relatively short. Now, base stations out in the countryside, like where Flight 93 was, can have considerably greater range. So this wasn't the fit, when you had AK doing that Project Achilles test, it wasn't a fair test because he was going over a populated area at a high altitude. In reality, there are multiple accounts supporting the idea that calls can be made from an aircraft at cruising altitudes. Now, this poses something of a problem for the fake phone calls theory, like Griffin's suggesting here, because if brief cell phone calls really can be made from a high altitude, then why would the conspirators need to pretend that Burnett had called from an airphone? Why not make them all cell phone calls, right? Therefore, bringing like GTE airphone into the cover-up. Now you have to add more people into the cover-up where you didn't have to. What's really more likely is that the conspirators decide to fake multiple phone calls to Dina Burnett instead of just one, and all for no good reason, because if she received no calls, then events could continue in precisely the same way. And she fails to realize that this is an imposter, and the conspirators go to the trouble of faking even a caller ID, only later to try and conceal that when it's entirely unnecessary. So or that a young mother in the worst day of her life doesn't have perfect recall of a sequence of phone calls. I mean, all this is basically ridiculous. You don't need to. And first of all, fake phone calls wasn't possible. I mean, the founder of voice morphing is Dr. George Papkin, who actually had to write a letter in 2002, basically suggesting that I have to be sitting next to the person recording their voice. And guess what? The people making those calls were on the planes that crashed. I mean, come on, ladies and gentlemen. Really, this is just absurd, these fake phone call theories and whatnot, so.
Not from 34,000. So they said there were only 2 cell phone calls, and those were from Flight 93.
He had gotten down to 5,000 feet.
Yeah, the Ed Felt call was at 300 feet, I think.
Well, they said 5,000. Maybe they've modified that in C.C. Lyles. So that was a rather remarkable change. They didn't tell the general public, because the public has gone on to this day believing there were cell phone calls from the planes. But if you read the 9/11 Commission report carefully, they never commit themselves to it. And in one of their background papers, they indicate there were only 2.
Well, how about this? Read the FBI pen bomb report. Suggests that there were 3 cell phone calls made. Okay, the rest were air phone. You don't even have to read the 9/11 Commission report for that. They omitted a lot of stuff. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. The stuff they omit is Griffin's not going to bring this up. He's only going to say, you see, they only talk about certain phone calls. Well, of course, because they're telling a story that modifies the stuff that they didn't report.
Now, what do you do about Dina Burnett's calls?
Nothing.
How could she have gotten calls that morning from Tom Burnett's cell phone
She did.
if now the FBI says there were no cell phone calls from...
What's the point of faking a phone call, right? What would be the point? Why don't you just say the calls weren't even made to begin with, like I said before? And the events would still play out anyway. I mean, this is ridiculous. I mean, some of the phone calls basically went against the script, like I said before. 6 on 77, which DJ Thermal Detonator made a film about. You guys tend to throw away evidence which shows evidence against the story. This is what kills me.
Tom Burnett, that he used a seatback phone. Now, the story...
Tom Burnett basically said he saw a gun on one of the hijackers. Well, what did the 9/11 Commission say? They only had box cutters. Where'd they get the gun from? Was it planted on the plane? Could have been. By the way, CNN reports days later after 9/11 that there were weapons found on certain planes, that there were additional planes that were going to be hijacked. Take a look at United Airlines Flight 23, for example. I made a separate podcast about that. 9/11 Commission report didn't report that. FBI investigated that and said, nothing doing. Who are those people? They don't even have to be Al-Qaeda. You understand? Operation could have been manipulated by who? But if you don't believe in hijackers, hijacked planes, you don't look into these profiles and backgrounds and stories.
It's worse yet. The most famous of all the calls from the planes were from Barbara Olson. She, of course, was a very well-known commentator on CNN. She was married to Ted Olson, who was the Solicitor General for the Department of Justice and had been very instrumental in getting Bush and Cheney elected in the disputed 2000 election. He told CNN that she had called him that morning from Flight 77, called him twice, talked to him for about a minute each time. He was uncertain whether it was cell phone or seatback phone. He went back and forth. But he said she reported that there were hijackers on the planes. They had moved them all back to the crew and the passengers to the back of the plane. And they were armed with knives and box cutters. The only reported call that mentioned box cutters. So that shows you how...
Well, I don't know. I don't get you. I don't get this understanding. Tom Burnett, which you just raised, reported that he saw a gun. There were other phone calls that basically said that they had knives, not box cutters, long knives. Why are you picking on his phone call about box cutters? Why didn't you mention about Tom Burnett's phone call? I don't understand.
Important these calls from Barbara Olson were.
Because it reinforces the commission narrative that these guys have box cutters. Well, on the opposite side of that spectrum, you could have used Tom Burnett's phone call and basically said, hey, by the way, this guy reports that he saw a gun. That's not in the commission report. Hey, let's investigate that. But no, you question just the validity of phone calls and throw away so much evidence, which basically shows that there are real anomalies against the official narrative.
Because everybody knows the hijackers had box cutters. These calls were instrumental in getting the war on terror started.
Well, no. No. It was the impact of the Pentagon, where Don Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, basically said it's an act of war, not from the phone calls. Oh, Griffin.
Because these evil Muslim terrorists had killed sweet Barbara Olson. Now, what does the FBI do about that? In 2004, when they sent their report to the 9/11 Commission, they still had the calls from Barbara Olson in the report. But in 2006, people in the 9/11 Truth Movement found out that Flight 77 didn't have any onboard phone.
Nobody's reporting. By the way, as for airphones that were operated by AT&T Air One, which is part of the Claricom Communications Group, Airphones were available on board American Airlines, Northwest Airlines, and Delta Airlines until 2002. And there are pictures of seatback phones on these planes as well. So they weren't eliminated before 9/11. That's a fringe conspiracy, right? That he's repeating. And look what he uses as evidence. People in the truth movement. No. Did he ask American Airlines? No. And watch the quote he uses.
No seatback phones, no onboard phones of any sort. What are you going to do then? You know, and so they call customer service and talk.
Oh, call customer service. Yeah, let's not talk to the actual communications airline division for American Airlines. No, let's call customer service. Like they're going to know.
To him, and he says, that's right, we didn't have any on the Boeing 757s that were made for American, not unlike those for United, were not equipped.
In fact, you know what I'll do for you, and I'll share it here. I'm going to share it here with you. I'm going to find it. Right? I'm going to do the work for you, Griffin, because you won't do it. I found it. I'm going to blow this up. Okay. Show you the date because, you know, this is what it took me seconds, by the way. How many seconds was that? Maybe 15. Okay. Okay. Dated, as you can see, February 6, 2002. Airlines are throwing away those phones built into the seats and they're blaming it all on cell phones. American Airlines will discontinue its AT&T in-flight phone service by March 31st, a spokesman for the airline said Wednesday. Almost since their installation in 1996, we've seen a dramatic decrease in the use of these phones, said Todd Burke, American Airlines spokesman. That's a mic drop, you ask me, right? I cut myself. Oh well. All right. Anyway, don't feel sorry for me. But yeah, I mean, look at it took me seconds to dispel this notion.
Equipped with onboard phones. What does the FBI do then? They can't say she called on a cell phone because it was too high. They can't say she called on an onboard phone because there weren't any. So they changed the story again in 2007. And the new story is this. There were no calls from Barbara Olson.
Well, no, that's not true either. First of all, I did a separate video basically explaining about the unknown calls, right? The unknown calls were all from Barbara Honegger. I mean, from Barbara Olson. Excuse me, use that name. Ooh. Right? So, yeah, those unknown calls were made from Barbara Olson. Why? Because she called collect, which doesn't show on the cell phone transcripts, which were made available in the Zacharias Moussaoui trial.
You can find this now
We'll
on
take a look
the
at that
graphic for the report that they turn in for, 2006 is when they changed the story, for the Moussaoui trial. And you find the graphic for Barbara Olson, and here's what it says. Barbara Olson, one call attempted, unconnected. And they always then say how long it lasted. 0 seconds. So this is pretty stunning. The FBI is part of the Department of Justice. He had been the Solicitor General for the Department of Justice, and now the FBI tells us that the story Ted Olson told about these calls from his wife, those calls never happened.
No, that's not what happened. That's not what happened. And Ted Olson never said this, and the FBI doesn't say this either. Okay? They showed the graphic of the unconnected, of the unknown calls, right? but they were all Barbara Olson, because she used, she called collect on an airphone. And you can match up the times with, say, the times that were made on the call and the times that were shown on Barbara Olson's phone. So in other words, the unconnected call, the unknown calls were made at a certain time, right? Match that up with the Claricom CTE airphone records, which were used in the Zacharias Moussaoui trial, and you could see the times match up one another. Like I said, I'm gonna link that video which I made to the bottom of the description.
So it seems like you got two choices. You've only got two choices. Either Ted Olson was duped, like Dina Burnett and the others were duped by fake calls, or he just made it up.
No, you made it up. You're the dupe because you basically didn't do your homework. And this is the problem with people like you and Jason Burmis and Barbara Honegger and Christopher Bolin and the dozens of you, dozens who basically drag the truth movement in the mud, basically not doing your homework because you already went into 9/11 as saying it was an inside job. And any other theory and scenario, no matter how ridiculous it is, has to be supported because it goes against the official narrative. And what is the official narrative to you? The official narrative is 4 planes were hijacked by 19 Muslim fundamentalists, which crashed into the World Trade Center, Pentagon, and Shanksville. That's it, which is basically a microcosm of the 9/11 Commission report. So there it is, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to cut it here. We don't need to hear anymore. It was near the end anyway. Like I said, I will link to the bottom of the description about the Barbara Olson calls, in which I basically easily explained about the times that were made on those unknown calls to the calls made on those seatback phones, which were Barbara Olson herself. All right, guys, take care. Have a great day.